Welcome to this TEL Researchers event. We're really pleased to welcome, I'll introduce myself. So I'm John Brindle. I'm a Learning Design Manager at Edge Hill University and also a student from cohort 14, the best cohort we like to call ourselves, of the PhD in Technology Enhanced Learning and e-research at Lancaster University. I'm really delighted. Something that I'm really interested in is open research and how we can be more open and equitable with our practice. The GoGN network, is it, or is it just GoGN? Or yeah, the GoGN network. I'm really pleased to invite to have you with us. There's four of you presenting today, so it'd be great if you could introduce yourselves, and then we can start. So take it away.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, John. And thanks so much, everyone. It's fantastic to be here. I'm just going to share some slides with you all a moment. So you should be able to see my screen. I hope that's all okay. And yeah, thanks so much for the warm welcome, John. And also thanks to Puyin as well for inviting us. We're absolutely thrilled to be here with you today to talk about, as John said, the Global OER Graduate Network, GoGN. So my name is Beck Pitt, and I'm here with my colleagues Rob Farrow, Paco Iniesta, and Martin Weller. And we're going to talk to you a bit about the network today and some of the things that we do. So what we're going to cover today is we're going to talk a little bit about what open education is, and just get a sense of, I know we've got lots of different people in the room. I can see some familiar names and faces, which is wonderful, but just get a sense of who's in the room and where people are at. I'm going to give you a bit of a heads up with a little bit of an activity as well, talk a little bit about openness for a bit, and then go on and talk about what we do, the Global OER Graduate Network. And we're going to do that in a number of different ways. We're going to do that first by taking a look at some of our members' research and some of the things that our members were working on in terms of their own doctoral research, and then take a couple of look at our own open practices as well. So you might have seen, if you looked on the website in our bio, there's lots of information about the types of things that we do as a network. We're not going to talk about everything today. We're just going to talk about two things, and that's our equity, diversity and inclusion guidelines, and then also our collaborative research outputs as well. So I'm going to talk a little bit about those as examples of our own open practices before we talk more about open practice and open research to kind of wrap up the session, and again kind of have a bit of a discussion around that before inviting you to get involved in GoGN. So before I move on, I just wanted to check in and see who's familiar with open education and just get a sense of who's in the room today. And I've realised with Teams that I can't actually see the chat. So I'm going to ask one of my colleagues, Martin, Rob or Paco, to just tell me what the feedback is in the chat, if that's okay. So just to let us know, just a yes or no, or if you're not sure, that's perfectly okay, obviously, as well. So just to let us know if you're familiar with open education. I'll just give everyone a minute there, and if someone can let me know the responses in the chat, that's super useful.
John's saying he's fairly new to it and really interested.
Thanks so much, John. That's great.
See some other people are typing.
Thanks, Martin.
We're going to say what we mean by open education later. So if you're thinking, well, what do they mean by it? We'll come to that, but just whatever it means to you. Fiona, hi Fiona. Says yes, from a long time ago, and interested to see how it has changed. And Sandra says research is only open accessible and docs that meet accessibility guidelines. Kyung-mi says hello, I'm Kyung-mi Lee, a senior lecturer from Lancaster University. I've been studying about openness, innovation in online distance education settings for the past few years. Oh, great. That sounds very interesting. And Danielle, who's one of our GoGN members, or now alumni, says that it's education that purposely allows for learning from outside the walls of a classroom. It can be based on learning from or creating OER or not. good definition. We can go with that one, Daniel. I think there's another response coming in, and then you can probably move on.
Thanks, Martin. Lovely. So I think, does anybody else want to jump in there?
Liam says, I work in research support role in UK HE Library. I think more in terms of OERs rather than open education as a whole. Yeah, it's good. Yeah, and it's a broad church.
It is, yeah. Thanks so much, Martin, and thanks everyone for their contributions in the chat as well. That's really great, and I can see we've got lots of different. Thank you to people that provided definitions as well, and people kind of saying about their experiences. I think that's really lovely, and I think it sounds a really great group of people that we've got here today. As Martin says, spoiler alert, we're going to give you a definitions here. There's quite a number of kind of different but slightly similar definitions of open education. We're looking at the TULIP one today here, and really, as was pointed out, and you know, as it's kind of says here, when we're talking about open education, we're talking about kind of resources, practices, and policies, learning, teaching, and education policies. So we're talking about a kind of ecosystem that uses the flexibility of OER to provide learners with high quality educational experiences. And someone mentioned open licenses a moment ago. And it says here, Creative Commons defines OER as teaching, learning, and research materials that are either in the public domain or they're licensed in a manner that provides everyone with free and perpetual permission to engage in the 5R activities. So when we're talking about 5R activities, this is referring to David Wiley's 5 R's, 5 rights: the right to retain, remix, revise, reuse, and redistribute. In this case, educational materials. And when you're thinking about Creative Commons licenses as well, for people that are familiar with those, obviously not all of the licenses enable you to carry out these activities, particularly things like remixing, for example. So yeah, just to kind of remind, or I guess refresh or look at one way in which we can understand open education. And as Martin mentioned, it's a kind of broad church, and we can see here that there's a lot of different ways in which we can understand openness as well. So from open practices, which we're going to talk a bit about today, from open access publishing, from open educational resources, to e-learning, to open education for schools. So different contexts, open education in different contexts. We're talking about open education in higher education, you know, today, but obviously OER and open education and open practice can occur in all kinds of educational settings. Massive open MOOCs as well, social media. So just wanted to draw your attention here to Openness in Education, a beginner's guide as well, that Martin was involved in co-authoring, looking at the history of open education, the concept of openness as well. So if you're interested in kind of exploring this further and reading a bit more, then please do go and have a look at that. It's also Open Education Week, so there's lots going on. This is a really good time to have this this talk, and you can go and find out more. There's different activities that are happening around the world, and different kind of resources that you can explore, all connected to open education. So do go and have a look at what's happening this week. The QR code there will also take you to a curation of activities that that people from the GoGN network are involved in this week as well. So please do go and check that out. So before we move on, just wanted to ask, and I know that some people have already responded in the chat, which is really fantastic, and this is connected to that, is what does openness mean to you? Kind of touched on and done a very whistle-stop kind of tour of different aspects of openness and one definition of open education. But it'd be really interesting to hear from you before we move on to talk a little bit more about what we do as GoGN, about what openness means to you. So I'll just pause, and again I apologise because I can't see the chat, so I'm a bit reliant on our colleagues. But if someone could let us know when people, if and when people add their contributions, that would be great. Thanks.
So John gets the prize for coming in first again. Transparent and clear processes and access.
That's lovely. Thanks, John. And I think that's a really interesting kind of connection as well to some of the things that we're going to come on and talk about in relation to open research later, and kind of not just about the end result, but that process and the kind of ways in which you can maybe be open or choose not to along that journey.
Liam says, apart from open access, I think the ability to reuse the material is really important. Kung-Mi says authentic accessibility given to all. And it's interesting, it's like John has said access and Kung-Mi said accessibility, and those two things aren't always the same thing. When you talk about open access journals, often that doesn't necessarily mean that they've got accessibility built in. So I think it's important we make sure that we're not bundling both those things together. Danielle says cautious and ethical interaction in open environments. And I like the cautious part there, Daniel. I think increasingly the caution is important. I can't see anyone else typing back, so you can probably
no, that's lovely.
move on.
Yeah, fantastic. No, that's lovely. Thanks so much to everyone for sharing. I think they're really important and important aspects of openness that people have raised, not just about materials but processes, and as well that difference, as Martin pointed out, between access and accessibility as well. Yeah, that's fantastic. Thank you so much. So I'm going to hand over now to Martin, who's going to tell us a little bit more about GoGN and what we do. Thanks, Martin.
Thanks, Beck. Yes, I'm just going to give the overview. So we are the Global OER Graduate Network, although as John said in the introduction, we sometimes refer to ourselves as the GoGN network. So we double up on the network bar. That's the problem with acronyms. Yeah, so it's funded by the Hewlett Foundation. We're in our 10th year of funding, so it's kind of quite well established. And the aims of it were to raise the profile of research and open education. This was particularly relevant sort of 10 plus years ago. I think, when OER was still relatively new, there was lots of evangelism about them, people saying they're a good thing, but not kind of a strong, solid research base. And I think people really wanted to kind of develop that solid research community. And it was initially set up by Fred Mulder at the OU Netherlands, and we took over from him. And the idea was to offer support for those conducting doctoral research. So he kind of really saw, and I think it was a real good piece of insight from him, that the most effective people group to target were doctoral researchers in this area, and from them you build up the community. And we have an aim to promote equity and inclusion in the field of open education research, and Paco will talk a bit about that later, some of the specific work we've done there. But also, as well as research into openness, particularly OER and open educational practice, we want to try and develop openness as the process of research. You're not just researching it as a topic and then disappear, but rather you develop these open practices as being part of the network. Do you want to go on, Beck? So it's the team. I think Beck's been through it. There's me. I'm the director. Beck, Rob, and Paco are researchers on the programme. Karina has been leading on the EDI work, and Kylie is our project manager. So we're mainly based in Milton Keynes, although I happen to live in Cardiff, and Paco hotfoots it between Madrid and Milton Keynes. I'm going to go on, Beck. So just some pictures of it. So we kind of, there's several things we do, and we'll probably come to that in a minute, but the initial idea was to bring about 10 to 15 researchers together once a year for a very intensive 2-day seminar workshop. There are a couple of GoGen people here. Danielle's here. She can testify to it being intensive, I think. Oh, that's my daughter ringing me at the most inopportune time. Sorry. And we bring people together, and that's usually allied with a conference. So usually OE Global or the OER conference, and we run it for 2 days prior to the conference, and then all of the researchers who come, and we pay for them to come and put them up, then go on to the conference. And during those 2 days, they get to present about their research in a fairly safe context, and we encourage people to be open and honest. It's like they can say, I'm struggling with my methodology. Has anyone got any input here? Those kind of things, and making those connections is really important. And often, even though it's got a bit better now, the community, the global community, often the people who are conducting research into OER or open educational practice, they might be the only person in their university, sometimes in their country, who are doing this kind of research. And their supervisors don't really know much about this area. They might have supervisors, from other areas, and so it's really valuable for them to connect with other people and to have that experience. Do you want to go on, Beck? So the network, did we update these numbers? So I think these numbers are a bit out of date now. I think we've got over 100 members now, from all over the world. And we also have alumni and what we call experts and friends, people who aren't conducting doctoral research but are interested in OER, and they may have been supervisors of OER researchers themselves. So we've seen quite a large increase in membership, and we've been trying to increase the number of members from the global south, because a lot of OER work, as many of you may know, tends to be dominated by the US, Canada, and Europe in particular. So we're specifically trying to target membership from the global south, that we think will really benefit as being part of the network. Is there another slide for me, Beck? Okay, so this sort of shows just the global spread of people we have. Yeah, go on. Yeah, and so when we bring people together, so we, as well as running the 2-day workshop, we have quite an extensive online interaction. And obviously during COVID we couldn't run it, so we would try supporting people through. We run webinars where people, new researchers, can present their work, and also we bring in experts. Rob will talk about some of the work we've been doing in co-producing outputs, and Pat will talk about some of the EDI work we've been doing. And so we try to encourage people to kind of make networks, and it's interesting some of the networks people make. So suddenly you'll get a grouping that forms around a particular methodology, which we hadn't anticipated. They'll form a WhatsApp group for autoethnography or something, a kind of a methodology that they haven't found many other people to connect with, or particular conceptual frameworks. We've had a lot of people doing work around social justice and OER. So this member said that they didn't feel alone in the doctoral journey now, encouraged them to submit more academic writing, and nudge them along. So we try to bring people from different stages in their doctoral study. So we'll have some people just starting, some people in the middle, some people are about to submit, and some alumni as well, so that people can see the kind of the range of things. And often I think it's really useful for everyone, but I think particularly people who sometimes, I don't know where all of you are in your doctoral studies, but sometimes there's that kind of midterm slump, and I think kind of it's a good kind of boost, I think, to get people through the line, to see other people's and feel inspired about what they've been done. So yeah, it's maybe an obvious or a naff thing to say, but I think creating bonds between people is actually really important, and a lot of people have formed very strong, kind of like lifelong friendships through coming to our sessions, and I think that's been really powerful. Yeah, Beck, that's it for me, I think. Thanks. Yeah, so I'm going to hand back to Beck.
Thanks, Martin. Yeah, so I just wanted to talk a bit more about building on what Martin said about the network and about what we do, and talk a little bit about our own member research, and just to give you a flavour of what people are looking at in the network. So we did a bit of an analysis, or we've been doing a kind of periodic analysis of what our members are working on, and kind of use the OER Knowledge Cloud and the work that Martin's done around this, and the focus of research on OER over time. So as you can see here, back in 2007, there was relatively little kind of published or available kind of research on the OER Knowledge Cloud around very specific kind of topics. By 2015, this has obviously kind of grown, with a particular focus on things like MOOCs, as well as policy and OER as subjects. So we kind of took that and had a look, if I can move my slides forward, and took a look at our own GoGN member research, and with thanks to a colleague as well, Bea Del Sarcos, who worked on this and did the analysis back in 2016-17, which kind of showed that at that point our members were particularly focused on practitioner aspects, practitioner-focused studies, for example, the impact of OER on teachers, and also on MOOCs, which obviously reflects as well kind of trends more generally in open education research. When we took a look at the end of last year at what our members are kind of focused on looking at, again, there's a very strong focus on practitioner-focused studies, but then also on OER as a subject, looking at OER specifically as a kind of topic, but then also on open practices as well. So things around open access, around open data, around OEP. This is also a really strong and prominent focus in our members' research currently. We also wanted to give you a bit of an snapshot and insight into published member research as well. So we have got a Google Scholar group for GoGN, and you can see here that we've got a large kind of growing number of outputs and impact of the network, and we have around 70 members in the group. So as you can see, I've got a really high kind of engagement with GoGN member and alumni research, and that continues to grow going forward. So that's just a very quick snapshot of what some of our members are looking at, and we'll return to that in due course. So the core areas in 2022 were open practices and practitioners. Kind of an emerging area in comparison to previous years is kind of OER as subject. And there's lots of kind of springboards and connections between research. As Martin mentioned, you know, quite often people will find that they're, for example, maybe working on using the same methodology, or looking at kind of similar focus in their doctoral studies, and those connections are really exciting to kind of see that kind of happening between members. But also application of OER and OEP in a broad range of contexts as well. So yeah, some really exciting research coming out from our members and alumni. So I'm going to hand over now to Paco, who's going to tell us a bit more about the EDI work that's been happening in GoGN. Thanks, Paco.
Thank you very much. So I think we can go to the next slide. So one of the objectives of GoGN and last year has been the focus as well on the GoGN EDI work package, which has been led by Karina Bosu. And one of the key aspects was to bring this idea of open research community to be more diverse, equitable, and inclusive. That's why the objective was to go to the communities and talk to practitioners and researchers in those with the support from champions in the region. So the first phase was in Africa, and it had the collaboration of colleague Judith Pete, and the second one in Latin America with Vivian Vladimirsky. And so the main objective was having that explorative research, talking to different stakeholders. So in the case of Africa, it included 9 interviews with different people from Nigeria, South Africa, Kenya, Egypt, and Rwanda, and as well today's face-to-face workshops with experts. And that was thematically analyzed and was a starting point to think about how to develop those EDI guidelines in the context of GoGN. Then the next phase in Latin America was affected by COVID, but included as well interviews with 12 stakeholders, including members from Latin America, from Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Costa Rica, Ecuador, Peru, and Uruguay. And it's well the same approach. So to have as well an online workshop with experts to validate the thematic analysis and gather new data. One of the key aspects afterwards was trying to see, okay, how we can produce those recommendations and implement them. So one of the ideas was to develop this Collega program, which we can see the logo there, with the idea to see how to support those who wanted to apply basically the use of English in the research. Unfortunately, during the pandemic, that was kind of complex. So we thought, okay, what's the best approach? We can use all the experience we've got, and it's producing first version of the EDI guidelines. Next slide, please. So we have spent quite a lot of time last year to reflect on what we have got from those phases and bring together definitions with a particular focus on open education, about equity, diversity, and inclusion, how other terms are related, as well as justice and social justice, and as well accessibility, and how they are affecting and they are complementing different concepts and definitions. And then reflect the document, which is available in the link. You can see a detailed analysis of the phase in Africa and Latin America with quotes from participants and the reflection process analysis done by the team. And I guess the interesting part as well is that takeaway guidelines with a particular interest for higher education institutions, as well for GoGN and individual practitioners. Next slide. So some considerations that are particularly for GoGN, but can be explored in different areas. And when we think about the community, is as well to create that environment in which individual differences and contributions are recognized and valued, as well to enforce the creation of that open research community that promotes dignity and respect for everyone participating there. As well to make that open research capacity building and development opportunities available to those students coming from the Global South. And this is something that we are always considering in terms of on supporting and incrementing the number of members from the Global South. In our values, it has to be important to promote equity, diversity, and inclusion in all levels, and to encourage those researchers and practitioners who feel they have been subject to any form of injustice. So they are able to raise the concerns, and GoGN can apply that to grow. And continually review GoGN open practices and procedures for that fairness, diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's important as well to think that this has been two phases. We got views from a limited number of participants, and in the future we are considering new phases that cover other parts of the Global South. Next slide. And now I hand it over to Rob.
Thank you, Paco. So I can explain the penguins. I was going to explain the penguins as we go anyway, if they can be explained at least. So I'm going to talk about some of our collaborative activities that we engage in with our members. Can we have the next slide, please? So one of the ideas that we had before the current phase of GoGN was partly inspired by the one-to-one meetings that we have with our members, where people can just, raise issues or ask for support. And one of the things that people often brought up was the idea that they don't really feel like they have good guidance around research methods in the open education sort of space. And this is something that came up quite consistently and was raised by a number of different people independently, but not really raised very often in the kind of group spaces, because partly, I suppose, there's that sort of imposter syndrome, anxiety stuff, where if you're a doctoral student, you feel like you're supposed to already understand everything about method, and you don't want to appear. This is often the thing people are most worried about in their Viva and stuff, is like, I'm going to get the question on methods, and why didn't you do it this way, and that kind of thing. So we had this idea for producing a research methods handbook, not just though sort of written by us for the open education kind of graduate students, but to actually try to leverage the network itself and promote kind of people sharing their experiences of actually using methods in that space. And this proved to be quite a sort of interesting and valuable activity. And this was taking place in the first year of the pandemic. So in some ways, it was kind of a nice focus to be able to work with people in this way and solicit these contributions. I'll say a little bit more about it in just a second. We also produced the Conceptual Frameworks Guide as a kind of sister publication, where the focus is more around the conceptual frameworks, which are a little bit sort of often subterranean or implied in what you're doing, but not necessarily sort of engaged with explicitly. And so we did a similar thing there, where we got people to contribute their experiences, and we kind of did a survey. We got them to write a bit of copy, and we framed that sort of centrally as the editors ourselves. Just to give you a sense of how kind of impactful it was, I think you'll have seen that we have something like 150 doctoral members. So far, that Research Methods Handbook has been downloaded 15,000 times, and that doesn't include the sort of, if you like, the dark reuse. We can't see what happens after it's been downloaded. It's openly licensed, so people can just share it with whoever they want to, and that's fine. That's encouraged, but it means we don't know like what's happening with it after that point. So the handbook and conceptual framework guide are useful to any researcher, really, not just a graduate student. The other things we've been doing are asking people to contribute to a regular annual review. This is the research review, where we find a bunch of interesting looking papers. And again, this is a kind of open practice thing, because what we're doing is basically pooling efforts, sharing transparently, and hopefully everyone's coming to a collective understanding of like what's happening in the field in the last 6 months or whatever. And so we have 3 years of that research review, again, openly licensed, and anyone can go and look at those. And we also publish our annual review each year, which is the kind of summary of our activity. And we also get the members to contribute to that. Can we move on to the next slide, please? Thanks. So penguins. So the story behind the penguins is, it starts with sort of chaos, right? In the sense that we were ordering swag, as you do when you've got a project. And I think, was it Martin that had the idea of getting a stress toy? Because hey, PhD and EdD students, of course they're stressed, right? They want a stress toy that they can, play with. And penguins were the only ones they had. Is that right? Am I remembering that right? So we ordered some penguins and had the GoGN logo put on it. But everyone was just like, love the penguins, right? So then it became like, we're going to have to kind of use these penguins in some way. And so what we've been doing is kind of adopting the penguin as a kind of mascot. But it really sort of took off with the artwork for these outputs. And so we sort of lent into it a bit with the idea of penguins, they survive communally in a harsh environment and this kind of stuff. You can go, down that road. If you look at our artwork, often the Earth is inverted, so the global South is on the top, and obviously the penguins are from, the global South. So there's a few things there. It's, we made it work. Here you can see a graphic from the Research Methods Handbook, and the penguins appear throughout as the kind of ones on their doctoral journeys. And here you can see something. It's actually quite a kind of complicated and possibly intimidating collection of information, but with the idea being we kind of trying to present it in a nice, accessible way. What you're looking at is really the spectrum of sort of metaphysical understandings of how research works through qualitative and quantitative, and sort of showing how different methods on the bottom relate to those. And really, it's not saying you have to do it any particular way. It's trying to understand what is the context in which you're working. How do you locate what you're doing? So yeah, Brian Mathers is the artist that we work with, and we have quite a long history of working with him now and doing different things. He helped us develop the sort of brand identity and that kind of thing. It's a consistent theme in these tools that we're sort of producing for people to use, is that we try to make it as accessible as possible and make it as easy to engage with as possible. So it is kind of cartoony in ways, and there are kind of cute penguins doing amusing things, just to sort of make it that a little bit more accessible than the kind of textbooks on method that you get. Can the next slide, please? So here's another example of the kind of artwork that's in there. This is actually from an old expired Open University course on research. but we redrew it as a map, an unfolded map, as if like this will help you find your way. But again, trying to take some of the intimidation out of it. If you do want to read more about the idea behind using the penguins and the artwork and the visualizations, there is a paper in the International Journal of Management and Applied Research, which we can share the link for if you're so inclined. Go to the next slide, please. So this is from the conceptual framework guide, and part of the concept that we had here for the artwork was wacky races, or at least the idea that everyone's on their own got their own vehicle, they're all heading towards the same destination, but they're getting there in different ways, and you don't necessarily have to do things the way other people are doing them. But so here you have the idea of stamps on a card, right? If you're like traveling between these places, you get a stamp on the card to show you've been there. And part of the idea here was to try and show you can use conceptual frameworks at different points in the research process for different reasons, and sort of making that explicit and trying to sort of shed some light on that. For the next slide, please. Here's another example where there's this idea, some people have argued that there's a certain kind of quality called doctorateness that conceptual frameworks can support in doctoral research. And so there's some ways to kind of, think about that. And again, trying to make it very approachable and very easy to kind of engage with. Cover the next slide, please. So one thing I think is key in our explorations of openness in research is the idea that it's something that can be part of any phase in the research process. So it's not just something that you could do as an afterthought, or I did my research, now I'm just going to publish my data set open access or something. That's cool, right? That's not a bad thing at all. But what we encourage is for people to really think about, what does openness mean in practice for them? Everyone's context is different. So how you engage with it and what you're able to do or inclined to do is going to vary, and that's fine. And yeah, so part of what we've been doing is kind of exploring, both in facilitating our members to do this, but also in our own work, we explore what does it mean to be open in this way. What difference does it make for the different stages of the research process, and how can we kind of make the most of that with other people, and kind of, again, sort of leverage the network. Everyone's benefiting from that through sharing openly. And so yeah, so it's a key idea that we try to get across, is the importance of not just, oh, I'm doing some research on MOOCs, but working openly, exploring the values associated with openness, and making that kind of core to what you do, rather than the sort of, oh, I published, I paid an APC and then published a paper openly. Okay, cool, but that doesn't mean you did anything else differently. And maybe it's worth thinking about how things could be, otherwise. I think, is that the last one for me? No, it's not, is it? Because I'm carrying on to the end. Yeah. Okay, so at this point, I think we could push out to the group and say, you may already be doing some of this, but what aspects of open are you particularly interested in? Are there certain areas where you think this is something I'd like to do a bit more of or know a bit more about? It could be to do with your theoretical background. It could be to do with how you share ideas, how you kind of collaborate with people, what kind of technologies and tools you're using, what your strategy is for publication, and all these kind of things. So really, it's opening up to discussion now and kind of saying, what do you think? Have you heard anything new today? Anything that takes your interest? Anything you would do or wouldn't do?
I think I'll jump in because I am hosting it. Everybody else seems to be jumping in, so I'll jump in because I'm interested in this. I think I mean I'd have everything open if I could. I think there's a lot of smoke and mirrors in research, and I would much rather conduct research in an open and ethical way than have secrets around what I'm doing. But I don't know whether I'm weird in that aspect, in that that approach, but I think I think there's a lot of misunderstanding in the world because we're not open about how research works, I think. And I've just recently deleted Facebook because I was just fed up with people saying, do your research, Google it. And it just made me feel a little bit cross. So yeah, I think the more open we can be about research practice and educate people about it, I think the better. So I'd have absolutely everything open if I could, I think. And that's part of what I'm doing here as well with the learning design processes. All of our learning design processes now are open. Anyone can come and attend a workshop and have their say on the way the course is designed. So yeah, that's my thought anyway. There you go.
Thanks. I think one of the sort of dynamics here is that it's not core to academic training to encourage people to think about this stuff, and in some cases it's the opposite of what you're encouraged to do. And I know that when I was a graduate student, admittedly not a particularly good graduate student, but the advice we were given was only publish your best stuff only in the best journals, and that was it. That was the strategy. And it's like, well, that's all well and good if you can get to that point and you can kind of go, yeah, I've got an amazing paper to publish, and you're going down a very specific track to try and get that postdoctoral position, basically. But when I look now at some of the people who were faculty there at the time, and no one's really read their work really from the level of citation that they get, and it's partly discipline specific. But if you want to be engaging with people and you want to be read, then publishing openly and sharing is the way to do it. It's just very effective. So even if you don't sort of accept some of the more kind of ideological aspects of this stuff around open values and social justice and blah blah blah, just at a purely pragmatic level, you might go, yeah, actually this is just a way to get read. And people are, increasingly, if things exist behind a paywall only, they sort of don't exist, right? Or at least I don't engage with them in the same way at all, especially if you hit your institutional paywall, or you haven't got a subscription to it. Okay, what then? You can go through a very sort of laborious bureaucratic process to try and access a paper, or you can have a look on, like, let's say, legally grey avenues and see what's out there. But realistically, those papers are not getting read as much. One thing I think, one aspect of that people might be interested in is blogging their PhD or doctoral research, and that's not something that comes naturally to people, because I think partly it's a confidence thing as well. It's very, very sort of tempting to sort of hide a little bit in the early phases, especially, and kind of like, I just need to read books for 18 months or something, and get my head around this sort of thing. But actually, and Martin's a very prolific blogger, just getting in the habit of writing and writing for people to read, it being out there, that's a massively important skill, I think, for doctoral research. And getting used to sort of more conversational approaches to stuff, rather than I have to become an authority and I have to be a lighthouse of knowledge and just I'm broadcasting this stuff out. It can be more like a dialogue.
It'd be interesting to hear, I think, if there's things people, and there's no wrong, this isn't for a judgment thing, is there anything that people wouldn't be comfortable sharing? And that can be, people might be doing research into more confidential, responses and things, and and there is lots of problems about anonymizing data, for instance. Even when you anonymize it, there's that thing, isn't there, with 3 bits of information you can target someone by sort of 80% accuracy, so even anonymized data isn't always as anonymized, or things they might feel worried about exposing. I think, and I saw Liam said he wouldn't feel comfortable about live streaming his Viva, and I think lots of people would agree with that. Liam might feel similar, and I think lots of universities wouldn't let you live stream it. But I've seen people do it, and make that. And one of our members, Gabby Whithouse, is really trying to open up the PhD process and the thesis process. So, but I'm interested if there's people feel, that there's areas they're less comfortable with.
So there's a few things coming in. So Kyung-Mi has some sort of general concerns, I suppose, about I don't know if you want to speak to this, Kyung-Mi, or if it's just, it sort of speaks for itself, but openness at different stages in the process and who has access to that. And I can certainly see there are arguments for making some things closed, right, for sure. I guess it's a question of which things and when, and it's like mine said, it's to what extent you're kind of feeling comfortable in it, whether it's appropriate. So John is saying he may have methodological reasons for not sharing data. Possibly I know this, but I don't recall it. What's IPA?
Interpretative phenomenological analysis.
Okay. So yeah, obviously if you could identify someone and that kind of thing, you might not want to share that. But no one's saying that you have to be fully transparent, right? It's not a dogma where you have to do things in a certain way. It's highly contextual, and it is going to depend on kind of what you're trying to share and what you're trying to get out of it. Puyin says, this is an interesting one actually. Does your institution own your work? Right, that's definitely an interesting one. And I know that for a lot of PhDs, the institution will say that is our research, especially if there's something in there that could be monetized, right? So you've got some sort of patent or scientific discovery. We were having a discussion recently, right? Was it with, I think I know who it was with, but anyway, when I went to some institutions will mandate, yeah, you can put your thesis in the library, but you've got to have it on a non-commercial license, because if anyone's going to commercially exploit that, it's going to be us, basically. It's our property. I think this is quite an interesting question. It probably is one where it pays to read the small print on exactly what's going on when you sign up for a doctoral degree. Does anyone else have any experience of this or any thoughts around, not being the owner of your own intellectual property?
I will just say that's often a thing that comes up with people sharing anything, any academic, and generally I think academics vastly overvalue the commercial value of their work. So you're not producing the breakthrough drug. Yeah, that's right. But I think people do get worried about it. But...
yeah, I guess in some ways it's that sort of like, it's a sort of competitive exploitation paradigm that universities have, where they're under pressure to monetize that stuff as well, and that's how it comes out, in the library, and how they want you to store your thesis. We also have a point around kind of choosing journals to publish in, and choosing it on factors other than whether it's open access, and totally get that. There's pressure on all researchers to publish in certain places, and in certain places are much more prestigious, and if you want to progress your career and get on, it's going to help you a lot to publish in those places. Some people do have a kind of policy of like, no, only open access, and only green open access, I can't remember. But what we tend to do in our group is try to strike a bit of a balance where open access is the default, but that doesn't mean that you can't sometimes go outside that, depending on the particular audience you're trying to connect with. So again, it's not a dogmatic thing where it's like, no, you must publish open access. But if you make it the sort of default, I think that's helpful. And a lot of the time, increasingly there are some very good and reputable open access journals. It's not like it was 20 years ago where the open access journals were sort of like the new kids on the block, and not seen as of the same quality. Obviously, we know that it's the same people doing the editing and doing the reviews and everything else, whether you're doing it for an open access journal or a proprietary journal. But the publishers have a lot more heft than the open access journals when it comes to the financial side. So
let's say, Rob, we've got 5 minutes left, and if we want to just open up if anyone wants to ask any questions specifically about GoGN, and do you want to go to the next slide, Beck, just to say people want to So if you're doing research roughly in the area of open education in some area, please think about joining us, and we could invite you along to a conference if that looks good, or at least be part of the network, and so you can go to their GoGN. Sorry, someone's got their hand up. Do you want to come in?
Thank you so much for the presentation. I've been always interested in the group, so it's nice to hear the history about it. My question is pretty specific because I'm tutor the program that we have our organizers here. And I find developing community like this is taking a lot of time and effort and also money. So if you can elaborate at the beginning of the entire initiative, how the funding kind of mechanism work, and what was the first thing that you tried to put the effort in, then I think it took up, fortunately, after some years, and now it's one of the really well-known group, everyone wants to come, but at the beginning it wasn't the case. So was it based on Open University, or if you can elaborate the first beginning in terms of the funding situation and how you have worked on, that would be interesting.
It's a really good point, actually. I mean, these things don't come free, we have to be paid, taking most of our expenditures, taking people to a conference, and that racks up in terms of flying people from different places and put them up, and providing food and registration for the conferences. So as Fred Mulder put in the initial grant for a case to the Hewlett Foundation, and they've been very generous and have kept us going, and that they see it as valuable as their thing to their network. And I think in those early years, it took a lot of effort to kind of, to your point, to get the kind of inertia going, to get the kind of, and so Fred would often sort of target people individually. It's like, I think Judith, who Becca mentioned, was someone that Fred sought out in Kenya to work with us and become a member, and use of other networks. I think so that kind of initial momentum really does take a lot of effort and a lot of time, I think. And even now, we saw during the pandemic, we had to kind of compensate for the face-to-face activity by doing a lot more activity online, and that sort of took a lot more time. It's like, so we're lucky to have funding this stuff. I think it'd be much more difficult to run a network like this, if you were just trying to do it as a community of practice with no support, But so I think it's kind of goes through different stages, and so now I think we're more about, we do sessions like this, but also we've built up enough of an identity, but also we work more on trying to, I think, identify good other networks that we can link into. So there's an ICDE doctoral network, for instance, those kind of things, rather than targeting individuals. But that's partly because we've got to a certain size, I think.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, at the initial onset, we weren't involved in it, right? So we took over, about 5 years after it started, or maybe 4 years after it started, something like that. So we inherited it when a lot of the kind of foundational work had been done to sort of establish, the annual seminar as a regular thing, and kind of people had started to understand how it worked and how it all fitted together as a global network and stuff like that. So I would say it's definitely taken quite a lot of time and consistency over time to get to this point. But when you get to a certain point, it kind of looks after itself to a certain degree. People don't have to go through us to talk to each other, right? We've got channels for people to do that. So
I will say Fred's thing about targeting PhD researchers, doctoral researchers was absolutely right, and a lot of those people then have gone on to become very influential in the area. People like Catherine Cronin has been one of our members, and Sarah Lambert and these people. So I think often that's so whatever you're targeting, whatever topic you're in, if it's a new topic, then I think that approach would sort of map across to that, I think.
Okay, I guess we're running low on time. Are there any more things to say? Penguins are cool, correct. So yeah, I guess any final thoughts? Anything anyone wants to share? Or
we'll share the slides with you, shall we, John Purin? Is that right? And then you can share them around.
Yeah, that would be great. And obviously the recording will be made available on the CTAL YouTube channel as well. So we will send that out to everybody as well. I can already see that Leo wants to share it with some colleagues, which is fantastic. I think it just leaves us to say thank you very much for a fantastic talk. Give you a round of applause there, and a really interesting field that I personally was not very aware of. Oh, Fiona, have you put your hand up, or was that a clap? Oh, it went back down again. I'm guessing it was a high five.
Emulate a clap by doing this, or like on and off, like.
That's it. Brilliant. Or it's just high fives. Or high fives all around. Virtual high fives. So thank you so much for everyone for attending. It's been an absolute pleasure and a privilege to have you here with us for this TEL Researchers talk by the GoGN Network.